you sit down to do something important, something you genuinely want to do, something that matters to your future, something you have been putting off precisely because you know how much it matters. And within 90 seconds, your hand is on your phone, or your eyes are drifting to the window, or you are suddenly and urgently aware that you need a glass of water, or you find yourself opening a browser tab that has absolutely nothing to do with anything you intended to accomplish. And somewhere in the background of all this wandering, there is a voice that says, "What is wrong with me? Why can't I just focus? Why is this so hard?" And today, I am going to answer that question completely, scientifically, and honestly. Because the answer is not what most people think it is, and the fix is not what most productivity content will tell you. And understanding both with genuine depth is the difference between spending the rest of your life fighting your own brain and spending the rest of your life working with it in a way that produces the kind of focused, sustained, high-quality attention that transforms ordinary effort into extraordinary output. Let's start with the most important thing I can tell you about focus, and it is this. The inability to focus is not a personal failing. It is not a generational weakness. It is not evidence that your brain is broken or deficient or fundamentally unsuited to the demands of modern intellectual life. It is a predictable, neurologically explicable consequence of placing a brain that was built for one kind of environment inside a completely different kind of environment and expecting it to perform as though the mismatch doesn't exist. Your brain was not designed for the modern information environment. Full stop. The human brain evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in an environment characterized by low information density, high physical demand, clear and immediate feedback between action and consequence, and critically, genuine, meaningful, survival-relevant novelty that required sustained attention to navigate safely. The rustle in the grass might be a predator. The change in the sky might signal a storm. The unfamiliar face approaching the camp might be a threat or an ally. In that environment, the brain's sensitivity to novelty and its tendency to redirect attention toward anything new, unexpected, or potentially significant was not a cognitive flaw. It was a survival superpower. The brain that ignored novelty got eaten. The brain that responded to it survived, reproduced, and passed on its novelty-seeking neural architecture to every human being alive today, including you, sitting there trying to read a spreadsheet while your phone vibrates with a notification that your brain is neurologically incapable of treating as unimportant without deliberate effort. This is the foundational paradox of modern focus. The same neural machinery that kept your ancestors alive is systematically destroying your ability to do deep work in the 21st century. And no amount of moral condemnation of your own distraction will change this, because moral condemnation is addressed to your conscious mind, while the problem lives in your neurological architecture, and architecture does not respond to guilt. Now, let's go deeper into what is actually happening in your brain when you try to focus and fail. Because this neurological understanding is not academic. It is the prerequisite for every practical solution that actually works. Your brain is not a single unified system trying and failing to pay attention. It is a collection of competing neural networks, each with its own agenda, its own activation conditions, and its own claim on your cognitive resources. And the quality of your focus at any given moment is essentially the outcome of a neurological competition between two of these networks that are, in a fundamental architectural sense, designed to work in opposition to each other. The first network is called the task positive network, sometimes called the central executive network, and it is the neural system responsible for directed, goal-oriented, analytical thinking. When you are solving a complex problem, writing a difficult email, reading a demanding text, or doing any form of sustained intellectual work, this network is supposed to be dominant. The second network is called the default mode network, and this is the network that is activated when you are not focused on a specific external task. When your mind is wandering, when you are daydreaming, when you are thinking about yourself, other people, the past, or the future. Here is the crucial neurological fact that most productivity content completely ignores. These two networks are anti-correlated, meaning that when one is active, the other is typically suppressed. And they cannot both operate at full capacity simultaneously. Every time your attention wanders from your work, what is happening at the neural level is that your default mode network has overpowered your task. Positive network. It has won the competition for dominance over your cognitive resources. And here is why this matters practically. The default mode network is not just activated by deliberate choice to stop working. It is activated automatically without permission at any moment when the task you are attempting does not provide sufficient stimulation to maintain task-positive network dominance. In other words, if the work you are trying to do is not engaging enough, not novel enough, not emotionally compelling enough, or not structured in a way that provides continuous cognitive demand, your brain will default to mind wandering, not because you are weak-willed, but because the default mode network is filling a stimulation vacuum that the task is failing to fill. This is the neurological explanation for why you can watch a 3-hour movie without losing focus for a single second, but cannot read a textbook for 15 minutes without your mind wandering. The movie is engineered to provide continuous novelty, emotional engagement, and narrative tension that keeps the task-positive network perpetually stimulated, while the textbook makes no such accommodation for your brain's stimulation requirements. Now let's talk about the single most significant external contributor to focus failure in the modern world. And that is not, as most people assume, social media per se, but the underlying mechanism that social media, digital notifications, and the entire architecture of modern technology exploit so ruthlessly. Intermittent variable reward, which is the most powerful behavioral conditioning mechanism ever identified in the psychological literature. B.F. Skinner's foundational research on operant conditioning demonstrated that behaviors reinforced on an unpredictable, variable schedule, sometimes you get the reward, sometimes you don't, and you never know which press of the lever will produce it, are the most resistant to extinction, the most compulsively repeated, and the most neurologically addictive of any reinforcement pattern. This is why slot machines are more addictive than vending machines. The vending machine gives you the same thing every time you put in money, which eventually becomes boring, while the slot machine might give you nothing, or something small, or occasionally something huge. And the unpredictability of the reward is precisely what makes the behavior so neurologically compelling. Your phone is a slot machine. Every time you check it, you might find nothing interesting, or one mildly pleasant notification, or occasionally something that produces a significant dopamine spike. And this variable, unpredictable reward schedule has conditioned your brain through thousands of repetitions across months and years of use to generate a powerful attentional pull toward the device at a frequency and intensity that has nothing to do with whether you consciously want to check it, and everything to do with a deeply conditioned neurological reflex that operates below the level of conscious choice. And here is what makes this particularly devastating for focus. The conditioning doesn't just affect you when the phone is in your hand. Research by psychologist Adrian Ward at the University of Texas found that the mere presence of a smartphone sitting face down on a desk, silent, with notifications off, reduces available cognitive capacity measurably and significantly because a portion of your working memory is continuously, involuntarily devoted to resisting the conditioned pull toward the device. You are paying a cognitive tax for having your phone nearby even when you are successfully not using it, which means that the people who tell you to put your phone on silent while you work are giving you advice that is directionally correct but insufficient. The phone needs to be physically out of the room, not just silenced, because the brain's conditioned response is triggered by proximity, not just by sound. Now, let's examine the role of sleep in focus failure, because this is the area where the gap between what the science knows and what the average person implements is most catastrophically wide. Matthew Walker's comprehensive research on sleep, synthesized in his landmark work on the neuroscience of sleep, establishes beyond any reasonable scientific dispute that sleep deprivation, defined as consistently getting less than 7 to 9 hours per night, which describes the majority of adults in developed nations, produces cognitive impairments in attention, working memory, executive function, and emotional regulation that are at sufficient levels of deprivation, equivalent to being legally intoxicated. The prefrontal cortex, which is the neural seat of sustained attention, impulse control, and the top-down regulation of distraction that focused work requires, is the brain region most sensitive to sleep deprivation and the first to show measurable functional impairment when sleep is insufficient. This means that the person who is sleeping 6 hours a night and wondering why they cannot focus is essentially asking their most cognitively expensive brain region to perform at full capacity while running on a fuel deficit so significant that the performance gap is neurologically inevitable regardless of how much coffee they consume, how many productivity systems they implement, or how much they berate themselves for their inability to concentrate. Caffeine, which is the most widely consumed psychoactive substance on Earth and the focus supplement of choice for the chronically underslept, works by blocking adenosine receptors. Adenosine is the brain chemical that builds up across the day and creates the sensation of sleepiness, but it does not eliminate the adenosine or address the underlying sleep debt. It only masks the signal, which is why the caffeine crash is so brutal and why chronic high caffeine consumption produces a tolerance effect that requires increasingly large doses to produce the same alerting effect while doing nothing to address the root cognitive impairment. The fix for sleep-related focus failure is not a more sophisticated alarm system or a more disciplined bedtime intention. It is the recognition, grounded in incontrovertible neuroscientific evidence, that sleep is the single highest leverage cognitive performance intervention available to any human being. That protecting it is not laziness or weakness, but the most rational possible investment in the quality of every waking hour that follows. And that no focus technique, no productivity system, and no amount of willpower can compensate for the cognitive deficit that chronic sleep deprivation produces in the brain regions that focus requires most. Now, let's talk about something that the productivity industry almost never addresses? And that is the role of chronic stress and its neurochemical consequences in the systematic destruction of attentional capacity. When you are under chronic stress, the low-level, persistent, unresolved kind that most adults in modern life carry as an invisible background condition, your brain is operating under a continuous cortisol load that has specific and well-documented effects on the neural architecture of attention. Chronic elevated cortisol shrinks the hippocampus, which is critical for working memory and the kind of contextual learning that sustained intellectual work requires. It dysregulates the prefrontal cortex, impairing its ability to suppress the default mode network and maintain task-positive network dominance. It sensitizes the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, making it more reactive to potential distractions and more likely to interrupt focused work with threat-relevant processing that hijacks attentional resources. And it disrupts the neurochemical balance of dopamine and norepinephrine in the prefrontal cortex that is required for the specific kind of signal-to-noise optimization that sustained attention depends on. In simple terms, a stressed brain is a distracted brain, not because the stressed person is choosing distraction, but because their neurochemical environment is actively hostile to the sustained attentional focus that their prefrontal cortex needs to produce. This means that any serious approach to fixing focus must include a serious approach to managing chronic stress through exercise, through sleep, through the reduction of unresolved relational and financial tension, through the practice of whatever nervous system regulation technique the individual finds genuinely effective, because trying to build focus on top of a chronically stressed nervous system is like trying to build a precise architectural structure on a foundation that is continuously vibrating. Now, let's move into the practical solutions. And I want to be precise here because there is an enormous amount of focus advice in the world, and most of it is either superficially correct but psychologically incomplete or actively counterproductive because it treats symptoms rather than causes. The first and most neurologically grounded solution is the deliberate structuring of your work into what neuroscientist Andrew Huberman describes as focused work blocks. Periods of intentional, single task, distraction eliminated, concentration bounded by defined recovery periods. And the research on this is remarkably consistent across multiple scientific traditions. Anders Ericsson's work on deliberate practice found that elite performers across every domain studied, musicians, chess players, athletes, mathematicians, typically worked in focused sessions of 90 minutes or less before requiring genuine recovery, and that attempting to extend focused work beyond this window without recovery produced not more output, but worse output, because the neural resources required for high-quality attention were depleted, and the additional time was spent in a degraded attentional state that rehearsed low-quality work rather than high-quality work. The 90-minute work block is not arbitrary. It maps onto the ultradian rhythm, the basic rest activity cycle that governs cognitive performance across the day and produces a natural oscillation between higher and lower alertness approximately every 90 to 120 minutes. Working with this cycle rather than against it, taking genuine, screen-free, physically active recovery breaks at the natural trough of the cycle, rather than pushing through with caffeine and willpower, produces more total focused work across a day than the relentless, unbroken, progressively degrading grind that most productivity culture celebrates. The second solution And this one is the most immediately actionable and the most consistently effective in the research literature, is the physical redesign of your work environment to make distraction harder and focused work easier, which behavioral scientists call friction engineering. Every time you add friction to a distracting behavior, putting your phone in another room, using website blockers that require effort to override, working in spaces specifically associated with focused work rather than leisure, you are not relying on willpower to resist the distraction. You are reducing the probability that the distraction occurs at all by exploiting the brain's well-documented tendency to choose the path of least resistance. And every time you reduce friction on the desired focus behavior, having your work materials already set up, having your priorities already decided the night before, having a defined start ritual that triggers the focused work neural state, you are making the disciplined behavior, the automatic behavior, which is the only kind of behavioral design that works reliably over the timescales that real productivity requires. The third solution, and this is the deepest and most transformative one, is the development of what meditation researchers call meta-awareness, the trained capacity to notice in real time when your attention has wandered from its intended object and to return it to that object without self-judgment, without drama, and without the lengthy internal narrative about why you got distracted that itself becomes an additional source of distraction. This is what mindfulness meditation, stripped of its spiritual trappings, is actually training. And the neuroscientific research on the effects of meditation on attention is among the most robust in all of cognitive neuroscience, with studies consistently demonstrating that even modest amounts of meditation practice produce measurable increases in sustained attention, working memory capacity, and the ability to disengage from irrelevant stimuli, all of which are direct neurological preconditions for the kind of deep focus that high-quality work requires. The practice is not complicated. You sit, you direct your attention to a single object, typically the breath, and every time your attention wanders, which it will, constantly, you notice the wandering and return. That noticing and returning is the exercise. It is the cognitive equivalent of a bicep curl for the attentional system. And like all exercise, it produces its benefits not through a single dramatic session, but through the accumulation of thousands of small, imperfect, repeated practice cycles across weeks and months of consistent engagement. And now, let's bring everything together in the final truth that this entire video has been building toward. The truth that is simultaneously the most scientifically grounded and the most personally liberating insight in the entire psychology of focus. You are not someone who cannot focus. You are someone whose brain has been placed in an environment that is precisely engineered to prevent focus, that has been chronically underslept and overstressed in ways that neurologically impair the very cognitive systems that focus requires, that has been conditioned through thousands of hours of variable reward stimulation to respond to the pull of distraction with a neurological automaticity that feels like preference but is actually conditioning, and that has never been given the specific evidence-based tools to redesign the environmental, physiological, and psychological conditions under which its natural capacity for sustained attention can actually emerge and operate at its full potential. That capacity is there. It is in you right now, waiting not for more willpower or more motivation or more self-condemnation, but for the right conditions, the right sleep, the right environment, the right stress levels, the right practice, and above all, the right understanding of what focus actually is, how it actually works, and what it actually needs from you. Build those conditions deliberately and consistently, and the focus you have been searching for will not be something you achieve through heroic effort. It will be something that simply happens as naturally and as inevitably as every other cognitive function that your extraordinary, ancient, magnificently capable brain performs when you finally stop fighting it and start building the world it was designed to thrive in. Subscribe for more mind secrets.